Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Lean In podcast. I am your host, Anders Sundquist, and I am very excited to be talking about global capacity planning today. I have with me my co-host, Chris Rosano, and I have Jeff Gray from ServiceNow. Jeff, I'll let you introduce yourself in a moment, but first I want to thank all of our listeners for tuning in. I hope you learned something today about the art and science of capacity planning. So I'll pass it over to you, Chris, to introduce yourself and then Mr. Jeff Gray.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see you here. My name is Chris Rosano, and I currently am an engagement and recruiting ops director at Flawless Talent, and we're a part of the Job Mobs organization. And I've been in industry for about 20 years and had the opportunity to work with our host today, or our guest today, Jeff Gray, at Amazon for a few of those. So we're looking forward to talking with Jeff about art and science. And Jeff, maybe you can introduce yourself, tell everyone a little bit about where you're at, and then I'll kick us off into our conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Hello, everybody. Yeah, my name is Jeff Gray. My extended title is Vice President Global Tech, or actually, let me change that. We just switched it. Vice President Global STEP and Digital Technology Talent Acquisition for ServiceNow. That's the short way of saying that is I lead tech recruiting for ServiceNow. I've been at ServiceNow for about 4.5 years. And as Chris mentioned, him and I worked together at Amazon. A little fun fact for Chris and myself, we literally joined Amazon on the exact same day, and we left Amazon on the exact same day. So I don't know how many people can say that, but that's my fun fact with Chris.
Yep. Cosmic Brothers.
Start date and exit date brothers. Wow, what are the odds of that?
I know.
Thanks for sharing that, Jeff. And again, welcome to the Lean In podcast. So we have some really interesting topics to uncover and unpack today. Again, the overall topic being capacity planning. So Chris, why don't you lead us off with the overall question about the conversation of capacity planning?
Yeah, Jeff, we've gone through this process with different employers and different scaled companies, different types of ventures, but there's usually a start off point that's different for everybody that works for them and their method. What's yours? How do you get into the conversation with the right people?
So first off for me is, and obviously I put a lot of thought into this as far as discussion for today, is even looking at like, what are we talking about when we bring up headcount management, workforce planning, etc. And, on the surface, it sounds really simple. So headcount management or capacity planning, whatever you want to call it, it's just understanding what are the hiring needs of the business and how does TA meet those hiring needs. But as we all know, it's far more complex than that. When I think about it, it's looking at one, what's the budgets from a finance perspective? Perhaps from an HR business side, what's the org shape, org size, location strategy? All that stuff to me ties together. And I mention that because to me, it's so important. The first question I always ask when I talk to TA professionals is, are you at the table, and at what stage are you at the table when we have this discussion? And for me, I just think it's so critical for TA that we are making sure we're at the table from the beginning. And when I mean beginning is looking when they start the planning phases. Often for companies that could be 5 months, 6 months before the start of the year. Some companies maybe 1 or 2 months before the start of the year. But whenever that is, it's making sure that TA is quote unquote at that table, because there's so much to me that we can offer that the other entities may not be able to offer. So many times, I'm sure you all, both Chris and Anders, in your experience, you have a company you'll come to TA and say, all right, we need to go hire 250 people in country X. We may not even have that talent available in the country. And so by making sure we're engaged at the table, we can help provide some of that market intel data. It helps us set our recruiting strategy, especially if it's for new roles like Gen AI, ServiceNow, for example. Right now, we're so focused on being number one software for Gen AI. How that's a whole new talent. A year and a half ago, we were barely even talking about that at ServiceNow. And so by having us involved as early as possible, we're able to help understand what those hiring needs are, set our hiring strategy, make sure we have the right capacity to meet those, whatever the hiring needs are. So anyways, for me, the initial conversation is just understanding how does headcount planning start, who's involved in it, and making sure TA is at that table.
And so, Jeff, jumping in about kind of the second part of that planning conversation, there's an important element of lead time. And you mentioned perhaps a new geo or a new role. What lead time do you require for global headcount management?
Great question. I always say I try to be a realist. On one hand, when you look at, for example, early in career university hiring, that honestly needs to be 12 to 18 months.
Wow.
But when we're looking at, let's just say, the professional hiring piece, I always tell the business, ideally, if we can have up to 6 months advance lead time, that's great. But things change so fast in tech. And so for me, trying to be a realist and almost like negotiating. And by the way, when I talk about the science and the art, a lot of the art to me is there's a negotiation that you do, whether it's with the finance side, business leaders, whoever it may be. Part of that negotiation is including the advanced lead time. So, for example, at ServiceNow, I've been leading the tech TA function for almost 2 years now at ServiceNow. When I first started, our advanced lead time was -2 weeks, meaning we wouldn't get the hiring plans until 2 weeks into the quarter. What
That's enough to be
was,
successful. Wow.
yeah, yeah. And what was fascinating to me is when I first took over the tech function, I sat down with business leaders and I asked for their feedback. And they said two things is one, TA cannot deliver on hiring plans and TA doesn't understand data well. Well, it turned out for both of those, essentially wasn't the accountability for each of those. I won't worry about the data part, but talking about the TA hitting hiring plans, like I said, like I originally found out, literally we wouldn't get the hiring plans until 2 weeks into the quarter. And in places like India, Europe, where often it's 2 months notice period from even accepting, it's impossible to hit hiring plans.
Right.
And so, anyways, long story short, we are now at the point where we have agreements. It's a minimum of 3 months where TA must have uh, um, the full hiring plan. But the second thing we do is we also break it out by quarter. And what I mean by that is, so when you look at the whole hiring, headcount management, workforce planning, there's the annual planning piece, and then there's the planning within the year. So for the annual planning piece, that is typically 3 to 5 months, we will get advance warning of what that hiring plan is. I would say year to year, that annual hiring plan is about 80 to 90% accurate. And especially in tech, it's so hard to predict exactly what you're going to do within the year. But when you look at it quarter over quarter, even there, we're making it very clear to the business that we must have at least 3 months advance warning of not only what the hiring plan is, but also the business is held accountable to making sure recs are open in that time period. Because I have learned they may agree, we may get a headcount plan, but if the business doesn't actually open the recs, then we're still on the hook to finish the hiring plan, but we're already set behind. So part of this agreements we have is the 3 months advance warning, but also that includes that they must have their recs open at that 3 month period as well.
So it really is an iterative process. It sounds like, the annual planning lays the foundation, and then there's an iterative process, quarter over quarter to meet the company's business accomplishments or goals, but also the market, right? Because the macroeconomic influences, must be strong, especially with the fluctuations we've had over the past year.
Yeah. It speaks, especially right now, because there's so much unknown with the AI side. And so you're spot on. And again, we do our annual planning that typically happens. So our fiscal year is on a regular calendar year, which makes it easy. So January through December, we will start the planning for the next year in about August. The neat thing to me, again, this is my second full year in my role leading the tech side. My first year, I was not at that table with any headcount planning. The business agreed that was a big miss on their part and my part not to have TA at the table because, like I said at the start, there was so much that I was able to provide to give them insight, like
Yep.
as we're looking,
Yep.
especially for new roles, locations, etc.
Yeah.
So we are at the table for that. But the bigger piece to me is this quarterly, annual or each quarter within the year that we are doing these deeper dives because things are changing so much from the original plan to what you see within each quarter within the year.
And that bleeds into a topic, just to elaborate for our listeners, Jeff, on who must be involved in this planning. You've mentioned, the business and finance and of course TA having a seat at the table, but break it down just crystal clear. So who all must be involved? And if you're a TA leader, trying to earn that seat at the table and wondering, how do I get there? Or who's
Yeah.
at the table with me? Who is it?
So I'll tell you, I have learned so much. If you would have asked me this 5 years ago, I think I would have a totally different answer. And so it has to be one finance because, of course,
Yes.
they're going to control the budgets. They're going to have the actual finance information. Second piece, of course, I'm biased, but I'll say is TA. I mean, again, for the reasons we discussed. And what's been so nice at ServiceNow is they see the value of TA. One of the cool things that I am proud to say, because of our evolvement and how we've done headcount planning, last three consecutive quarters, the last 3 quarters on the tech side, we have hit headcount and hiring plans. We've never gone back-to-back quarters of hitting headcount or hiring plans at ServiceNow on the tech side, and now we're doing it 3 straight quarters, and we're on pace to do it our 4th straight quarter. So that shows the value of having TA at the table. Beyond finance and TA, though, is also what we call it business ops leaders. Might be the chief of staff, whoever represents the business side. So you have the TA entity, the finance entity, business, and then HR, or we call it people team. Because again, when you look at all these different pieces, whether it's the hiring piece, org shape, DE&I, which is important piece for our strategy, org design, location strategy, all that, we all have a piece of information that we can provide. So we all have to have a seat at the table. The last thing I'll add, and this one recently hit me over the last 6 months at ServiceNow, is also within finance. You may have business finance, which is making sure the business has the right headcount. That may not be aligned to quote unquote TA finance or HR finance. And
Yeah.
what I mean by that is who's paying for the TA capacity? If you're increasing hiring by 30% and we don't have the resources, so many companies, the two finances don't talk to each other. So one of the biggest things I've learned is asking, one, how are the TA resources going to be funded for any increase in hiring, and making sure whoever's that decision maker is also at the table.
Wow. Wow. Excellent distinction. That's actually new information for me. And so if you're listening today and that's new information for you, I think it would be important to talk with your internal organization about who's paying for the expanded headcount. Where's the budget coming from? And Jeff, I think this breaks into the science and art question or
Yeah.
topic that you foreshadowed earlier. It sounds like it's equal parts science and deliberate and intentional planning, but there's an art to it. And tell us, so how do those differ? What's the art piece of the planning versus the science and the numbers?
Yeah, I think like when it comes to the science, it's creating that process. And when I look at a process, whether it's the annual, advanced annual planning, or even, the quarterly within each quarter planning, it's making sure the science is, what are the timelines? What do we agree to the timelines? What's the simple math to say, like, for every 10 additional hires, you need 1 extra recruiter? Like, our capacity, it may vary by region, but at least we know, like in EMEA, APJ, and AMS, for X number of hires, that tends to be 1 extra recruiter. It's on the tech side, it's usually about 10 to 12 hires a quarter. Other processes is like the science side is defining, what does success look like? And then who's the D? Who is ultimately making these decisions on, like, okay, we've shared our TA side, finance shared their side. How do we decide who ultimately, what headcount gets approved by region that fits all this our location strategy, our D&I strategy, etc. So that to me is the science. But what I really recommend on the science side, or whatever you want to call this, is bottom line is document the process, because unless you have something that you can relate to, when something goes bad, or if you miss a headcount target or whatever it may be, people are going to be quick to point fingers.
Right.
And just be very clear that you're aligned, and never assume, like, TA, we assume finance agrees to this. Make sure it's in writing. The art form to me, though, and this is what I absolutely love when it gets involved in headcount management, is having these nuanced discussions. So I'm going to make up a completely hypothetical example, but let's say we have an agreement that we're going to do 250 tech hires in India next quarter. We're starting to see the business pick up with our competitors. We're starting to see longer time to accept, in a decrease in offer acceptance rate, etc. And so I may go back to finance and say, hey, is there a way, can we move 10 to 15 of these roles out to the next quarter's headcount target? It's getting harder and harder to fill these roles. Are some of these less priority hiring? And it's almost like this bartering, haggling with the business, because something for me as a TA leader that I take so much pride on, and you heard me say it earlier, is if you give me a hiring plan or headcount target, it's my job to hit that headcount target. And I do whatever I can to make sure we do. And it's important also for finance, because finance, by hitting headcount targets, they're better able to forecast the spend, our revenue, etc. And so to me, I always tell our team on TA, it's absolutely critical that we are hitting that headcount target. So I'm very realistic. I try to be as realistic as I can of that likelihood to hit headcount target. And I always tell the business, if I'm asking to move some headcount out, it's not to make it easier for TA, but it's, can we have these honest conversations? Are there some give and take for less priority roles? If these roles truly are top priority, don't change it. But that's the art to me, is by having these discussions. And you can't do that just by having a formula or a science behind headcount planning. It is having these constant discussions. And one of the things that I'm really proud of that we have done at ServiceNow is so we call our executive, our C-suite, they're called P5. And so for every P5 group, we have a monthly workforce planning pod. Those workforce planning pods are exactly of the groups we just talked about. It's TA, finance, business ops leaders or chief of staff, HR. We all join once a month and we discuss all things headcount and workforce planning. And a big piece of that is, how are we trending to hit current headcount targets, etc. But the other piece is looking at the next quarter ahead, and it's having those discussions, looking at, can we make some trade-offs to really, whatever that headcount plan we agree to, TA's on the hook to deliver on that. Yeah. And that's the art form that I'm talking about.
So you heard it here, folks, the art and the science of capacity planning. So thank you, Jeff. We'll take a water break here, team. I'm going to pause.